Hello and welcome back to Climbing on Mount Sophia. Today I am joined by my friend Steve, who as always proves a gracious and deeply insightful climbing partner. I'm also joined today by my older brother Aaron. Aaron has been deeply integral in my story throughout many stages, and especially recently we've been doing a lot of non-recorded conversations attempting to explore the mountain. On this adventure, we attempt to lay out a model of the mountain as such. This model, Aaron has labeled a theory of constraint feedback for contextual relationship of being. Thank you for joining us, and as always, engagement or thoughts are deeply appreciated in the comment section or on social media.
Okay. Yeah. So like I was saying, in this poster, there's probably 4 or 5 of those cars that I worked on personally over the years while I was doing vintage Datsun racing, restoration and race support and stuff like that. This one happens, like I didn't work on any of those cars specifically, but there was a museum at the old Riverside racetrack that closed down shortly after the event where I got this. And this is signed by 30 or 40 drivers that were all active in the 50s, 60s, 70s primarily. And a number of them have passed away since then. That's about 10 years ago I was at that event. So yeah, I ended up in vintage racing for a while, not with any real intention to be there, but it was a great experience that exposed me to lots of different people and different environments. And yeah, it was fun. And those are some of the mementos, I guess, that I have from that.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've always loved cars. So I've always wanted to take like an advanced driving course and just go nuts somewhere on an airfield or something like that. It'd be fun.
There's no better way to drive a car than on a racetrack.
Yeah.
In fact, it's the way I'd prefer to drive a car every time I get in one, honestly, because there's no, it's a pure feedback experience for sure, with a real margin of risk that you can't necessarily mitigate fully. You know, the newer the cars are, typically the safer they are to drive, even though they're faster. You know, a lot of the cars that I worked on were from an era when safety was maybe a third or fourth kind of pure concern. And so, fast. Yeah, you know, unfortunately, like in many other things, a lot of people died in racing in somewhat preventable ways, you know, in retrospect, but we didn't really know. You don't know what you don't know until you start learning and exposing yourself to new information. And there's definitely a pattern of that's occurred in motorsports over the last 120 years.
For sure, yeah. Is this a family thing or just an Aaron thing with the cars?
My other brother, just younger than Aaron.
Oh, there's more.
There's 9 of us actually.
Oh wow! All right.
Yeah, there's crazy. five boys and 4 girls. I'm the oldest, and okay. I should say, I'll just preface with this. This is going to be like a permission forgiveness statement. I know that my brother here goes by Ken. He's like 11 years younger than me, and I've called him Kenny my entire life. Yeah. He also shares his name with our dad. Okay. So Ken is my dad. So I'm going to call him Kenny probably every time we interact through this conversation. And I could try not to, but that would probably be cumbersome. So it's a permission forgiveness beg ask right there. It's just like, sorry about that.
I think I can manage that. Yeah, I figured it out.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So 90, that must have been crazy growing up.
Yeah.
You don't really know.
Yeah.
Until after you get some distance. And you know, that was a an experience that occurred in really different ways for all of us. Not only are there 9 of us, but there are no twins or anything. So we're spread out relatively consistently over almost 20 years.
Mm.
And, therefore, like my baby sister is 19 and a half years younger than me. And it's simultaneously an interesting opportunity to observe patterns and trends on all kinds of different scales with a fairly large sample size, which you don't often get
Just
with that kind of distribution. And, at the same time, it presents some challenges for sure, because, Kenny falls in a middle ground in the family where there's some sort of distinct cutoffs almost, and a lot of it has to do with the experiences that we can remember as children. And so the oldest 4 of us, I would say, or so, maybe 5, are pretty equal, like fairly closely lumped, and then the last 4 more like almost a separate experience. Like Kenny has no recollection of life, I think, when we lived, like I was born in the mountains in Southwest Colorado, in a little mining town. And Kenny was born right before we moved from that side of the mountains over here to the northern Front Range of Colorado, where I live now, and where we, he for sure grew up. But like, he doesn't really have a memory or recollection of life over there and all that. And I have, formative and distinct memories of all of that. So, that creates we're all living kind of a different story in a sense, and we have some overlap, but then the overlap between like me and our youngest sister is minimal in an experiential sense. The life that she experienced was, not comparable to mine in so many different ways, even though we share parents and this whole group of siblings and like all this sort of thing. So it offers a challenge in trying to, like, I guess, create, for me anyway, I speak from my perspective, it's like trying to develop relationships with, people who were small children when I was a young adult. And, therefore, like, our relationship wasn't really very sibling like. And then I moved to Southern California for 10 years, and some of them were growing up during that time still. And so I was an older brother that was, married and 1,500 miles away, and, eventually was having my own children, and like, we saw each other now and then. But I moved back here. I got kind of more frequently in touch with some of them, but it's still, it's a different experience for sure, because you don't have the relating commonality points where, the older, the 2 brothers that, I mean, maybe we'll tie back into the cars and automotive thing here. Our brother that's just younger than me got very into diesel truck performance, sled pulling and stuff like that. And he's a highly certified, very qualified mechanic, even though he doesn't really practice it. And so the interest goes pretty deep. Him and I were tearing apart cars. Our dad had kept an old car for us out of the garbage. He picked up in Telluride when I was little. He just kind of hauled it around with us everywhere we went. And eventually we got old enough to tear it apart and start kind of fixing it, making it work. And so we had because we were homeschooled, we had a reasonable, like a lot of pretty unrestricted free time. We, in lieu of pursuing more destructive activities, I guess, we tore into things like that and just, figured out how to make things work and how they worked. And
well, that's a crazy thing with that many kids in the house. I imagine that more like hands-on, figure out yourself almost has to play a role, because there's always a baby, right? Like we just had our 3rd daughter, and how much it changes the dynamic to have a baby there is huge for the other kids. Like I've met a lot of people that'll say, "Oh, we raised our kids the exact same way. We don't know how they turned out so different." And I'm like, it's not possible. They had a completely different experience just because the first one was there before the second one. That's absolutely everything is going to be different about those two experiences.
And yeah, and you know, with some perspective as a parent, you also, I think, if you deploy some awareness in your relationships with your children, it's pretty evident very quickly that they're actually all very different. And
yeah,
there's no way you can interact with all of them the same.
exactly.
You just can't do it.
They won't let you. They don't treat it the same.
Yeah. Well, your outcomes aren't predictable if you try to follow that kind of pattern.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, okay, so there's something that we're going around here a little bit, and this is that, you know, variability in experiences that are really closely linked, but also similitude. And this is something that I've thought about a lot, and we've talked about myself with both of you in different contexts before, but this issue of the way in which, and especially maybe through the lens of family, how we're all distinctly in some way almost the same. Our DNA makeup comes from the exact same pool, although there may be differences between the ways that it came together. But for all intents and purposes, we're continuations of our parents. And the way in which that manifests into the multiplicity of the children, and how even though you have really, really distinct continuity, there's massive differentiation. And so there's this overwhelming arch trajectory of all time, that time is essentially a complexification of matter from one iteration to the next. So, I mean, I don't know. I let's maybe talk about that whole thing of how, you know, in the generations of human beings, we go from the same thing to more of the same thing that differentiates massively, but also maintains a sense of sameness.
Well, yeah, I think the thing that jumped out to me right away is that trend is also how more obviously, I think, happening on the cultural level, where we go through these cycles and patterns, and then the individuals are kind of playing that out within their own family generationally as a sort of slightly shorter loop, but is also happening. I think that's fascinating, because I think fundamentally we are ultimately a reaction to each other. And so whenever one person takes an action, there's a reaction that's taking place. And we're kind of created by each other more than ourselves, at least initially. And that's something that's fascinating to me.
I think there's certainly an aspect where we know each other, or we know ourselves better through our interactions with each other. You know, it's something in that idea of like relativity, that, you know, you require a sounding board to gain any kind of perspective on your location. And the thing that I think strikes me as probably the most cohesive element, because, you know, like Kenny said, there's diversity in, it's actually really interesting to break down and delineate where there's more diversity and where there's more consistency. Because, you know, like out of the five of us brothers, Kenny and I are the only two that still have an appendix. So, you know, it's like, yeah, the probabilities within the subset are significant, right? And even though we don't have like a history of it in previous generations and stuff like that, it's like within the sample, probability is not looking great for Kenny and I, or in our, you know, long-term connection to our appendix. But, you know, at the end of the day, I think the most significant thing that strikes me as a continuity factor, and Kenny and I have discussed this quite a bit, or referenced it often, is our use of language, the common definitions that we share, the, you know, the obviously, you know, we grew up in an environment where we were using enough, you know, theological language and stuff to be over the same time, even though maybe I was older and Kenny was younger, Kenny really grew up in it. I experienced the transition as we went into some of those churches and stuff. But, this has allowed us to have conversations where we're able to go deeper into like abstract concepts with fewer steps, because there's so much energy required in some of these conversations in defining the terminology that you're using and the context within which you're trying to utilize it, that that's almost of a incalculable quality. Like, we were able to cover lots of ground very quickly on some subjects that otherwise I think would bog down a lot of conversations.
So let me see if I can tie two things together, because the first thing that came out was the way in which we exist as a function of each other, which I think, which is there's really good ground for. I mean, Nishitani basically argues this straightforwardly in Religion and Nothingness, and Vervaeke makes a very, very strong argument for it in The Elusive Eye. And so there's that. And then what Aaron brings out is the language as the function of maybe the means by which we exist in the space of the other. And so maybe there's a way in which, okay, so that model that I laid out initially of human beings through generations complexifying both by differentiation and condensation. And you have that, like, if done properly, if the language is not corrupted, you might say, the space between the two is not corrupted, you have an increasing complexification that is done elegantly. And to the degree that the language is mistaken between, you get a discontinuity, which is the same thing as sin in a way, because sin plays very closely with language. And in the way in which we're all interrelated, like you're talking about, Steve, and for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. I mean, that's true in the space of consciousness, you might say. And so every sin corrupts the language, and vice versa.
Yeah, and these really, what a culture or religion is a set of these psychotechnologies that can be beyond language, but also within language. That's what they are. There's certain phrases, there's certain terms that represent so much meaning, because it's ultimately language is a compression of pattern to exchange it, more effectively. And so you have these capacities that you're speaking of that come from traditions and from ways of thinking that have been refined so many times into these words that allow you to build on them. And because we're kind of laterally connected in how we create each other in the moment of our own time, but across time through these psychotechnologies, the parts of culture that get passed on to us are connected in that way too. And I think that's what's driven so much of our interest, Ken, in talking about is the emerging world of new psychotechnologies, and also the resurgence, I guess, of previous ones that have been lost. What stuns me is that it's not at all a linear process. It is hard to say we've not lost more than we've gained, and certainly in certain areas of this process.
I don't think there's any question that there's a large amount of rediscovery to be done. And, I think, obviously, Steve, you and I haven't really talked that much, but I definitely share that same interest. Kenny would, he's our middle point here. The question that we've been approaching from a number of different directions is like, how do we develop a context within which to hold all of these ideas where they're not in a constant tension? Because the impression that we've kind of distilled down to is something like, there's one of these cycles, these longer term, lower frequency cycles that is something like an implementation of technology, at least if you want to call it maybe psychotechnology, but technology for sure. If you use the example of something like the Aristotelian revolution, the axial age, and the kind of disruption that brought to the individual's ability to reconcile, the story of the past and anything beyond the material frame as something with valid referential quality, then there's a period of a few hundred years of kind of disruption and chaos and this mingling around, and then you have the emergence of Christ, right? Which offers again sort of a context that reunifies or provides a way to hold things without this tension, right? It reconciles, in a sense, the axial revolution to God, or to being, right? To man's connection to being beyond the physical, material frame. And then we experience something like that to maybe even a more cataclysmic degree in the Reformation and Enlightenment period, where, our ability to scientifically reduce the world as we encountered it increased so quickly. And, we developed theories that we can apply with regularity to predict outcomes with high probability. And, even within mathematics, where we have formulas that we can't fully prove, we've learned how to use them with high degrees of efficiency. And, and all we've ended up with in there is layer upon layer of discoordinated tension and conflict, because our standard model of physics, which works really, really well, doesn't mesh with our quantum model of physics, which also works amazing at describing the reality that we inhabit. These kind of conflicts, along with something like an inability now to reference anything outside the material, because we broke all of our framework of how to think about God, or what context to approach, like you're talking about, this old information, the stuff that, a lot of it we've had in some sort of context for a long time, right? Scriptures and ancient texts from all different religions. But then we're constantly discovering things that are older than that we don't have any kind of real context to place that, to even make that information relevant to us. But that's what we really need, because and not something like a perfect model, because I don't think that's the thing we should aim for, right? The thing we need is a working model, but it needs to provide us with a context that allows us to go beyond the material world. And like Kenny and I have been discussing quite a bit, is like plotting some through lines throughout history. We can pull out some strong patterns that show us, like, maybe directionally where we should begin to look. And maybe how we can begin to structure our concepts of the different tools we've developed in physics and mathematics and the observations that we encounter in ways that resolve the conflicts and allow them to do their jobs better.
There's a way in which, like, what the prophet does is show up and take the through lines of the patterns that are below him, as it were, in the historical frame, and distill them down, and by means of them move underneath the tensions that have been held between them, right? Like, that's what Jesus does.
Reconciliation.
And then create a new floor to stand on, in the way of speaking that you were, Steve, about the lateral language, being able to stand on it.
Yeah, and I think that tends to happen, or tends to need to happen, once the bedrock has fractured. Because even in the axial age, in the ancient Athens, basically a lot of those traditions that it's known for fell apart once people lost faith in the city of Athens, because it was their bedrock was the greatness of the Greeks. And once they were defeated in war and they had all these, tumultuous times in their own nation, they realized that they weren't actually, these demigods that they thought of themselves. So their bedrock crumbled at that moment. And throughout history, I think when that bedrock, whenever you're not building on the ultimate, you're building on some more local substrate. And when that crumbles, I think there's a need to kind of, be able to look beyond the conflicting substrates to the ultimate and bring things back into unison. I think that's exactly what you guys are saying as well.
Because it seems like, regardless of what resolution we achieve, we always, within our material reality and space-time, there seems to be a constraint of duality. Like there is sort of a constant tension within it. Mm-hmm. And we observe this, for all of recorded history. And this is where we get the yin yang and all different depictions of this balanced chaos order.
And even the
tension.
the base layer of just material as such, no matter what level you want to pick it, has a positive and negative pole.
Right. That seems consistent. And so that pattern across time tends to replicate as well, it seems like. And it's not we tend to look at these things and frame them in, good or bad, better or worse kind of context, based on the metrics that we define as, important. But within the longer cycle, it's a necessity. Mm-hmm. If it doesn't burn, the phoenix doesn't rise. And, there's all kinds of variations on that. And it's a question of, I think, scale maybe, or even trajectory in the pattern, whether that's necessary or whether we're actually progressing towards something like the ability to achieve a layer of unity through the implementation of new psychotechnology. Because, there does seem to be implications on different levels, right? That's how the kingdom of heaven is created. That's a picture of a layer of unity. It doesn't have the same kind of resolution, in a sense, that you can achieve through a layer of duality where there's tension and you get that back and forth generative kind of process. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't seem, or actually it maybe seems like these different layers tend to follow a pattern of a unity duality kind of layer when it comes to constraint application, because
the fundamental aspect of constraint is to create a multiplicity. That's the definition of the constraint, is that it takes a unity and creates a multiplicity. And so, the Christian vision of the kingdom of heaven is not unity as such, but unity and multiplicity fully preserved on their own ground. And this is one of the things that, I don't think I really took seriously enough about Christianity, especially over the past while, because I've gone pretty far down the Eastern rabbit hole. And deep down that rabbit hole, it ends up being, in a lot of areas that you can go in, it ends up being very Gnostic. And we've talked about this before a little bit with the Buddhist move to just, this is all an illusion, and fall into nirvana. Now, that's not all complete, because Nishitani would argue that the true nirvana is nirvana siv samsara, which is nirvana brought here, which is, I think, the same thing as the Christian vision, because the Christian vision is truly fully material, fully spiritual, fully embedded, full, like each person fully on their own ground, but each person fully within the ground of God. Which looks something like constraints fully embraced, fully allowed for, and awareness being fully present in every moment, I think.
Well, I imagine it would probably be something like agape, right? An expression of agape.
So what do you mean by constraint? Because I can tell that your definition is richer than mine. And so I'd appreciate just an elaboration on that.
Yeah, this is, I mean, I'll take a shot at this.
No, and then, this is Aaron's better.
This is a big one.
And then, Kenny can fill it in because I may miss some things. This is something, let me set a little bit of context. So I still build cars. I have a shop. I work by myself. Almost all the time I have Bluetooth earbuds in, for hearing protection. And I listen to music or podcasts or, a variety of things, but it gives me an opportunity to ingest a lot of information. And Kenny's experience is so different because he's constantly interacting with people, lots of different people, all with these kind of different, maybe in similar situations oftentimes, but everyone's unique. And he has these opportunities to interact and get all this feedback. Well, me, like I'm working with things like steel and aluminum and, wire gauge sizes based on amperage loads. And I work with these kind of feedback mechanisms also, but they're not the same. And so I'm doing stuff like that. I'm constantly processing background information through oftentimes podcasts, sometimes music. And I like to listen to Alan Watts. I like, so I'm going to just pull in right at the beginning some of the names that have really contributed to this, because I don't think that there's anything that I come up with uniquely or, novelly necessarily, right? I'm uncredentialed and all of these sort of things. So I'm just a guy synergizing information across all kinds of, seemingly disparate, but sometimes connecting points. So I've been drawing a lot off of John Vervaeke and Donald Hoffman and let me throw a couple other. Lee Cronin, if you're familiar with assembly theory, I think it's a fascinating thing that I don't really know how to fit in yet, but I mean, expanded my thinking in many ways. The Weinsteins, Jordan Peterson. Did I mention John Vervaeke? I'm pretty sure I did. Like John's Awakening from the Meaning. I did that. I binged. Yeah, and McKenna. I binged The Awakening from the Meaning Crisis over a couple of weeks while I was building a set of barn doors for somebody. It was big steel barn doors and fairly intricate. And it was just back to back to back long days. And so I just bombed through that. And that was the kind of thing that, because context is so important, that it allowed me to begin to line up and reconcile a lot of things that, maybe I hadn't even necessarily recognized were in tension. But, it's like when you open your mind and you start engaging new information and you start to encounter things that have a resonance, but you don't have a way to connect them to a model, you have to commit to something like engaging the energy to hold them at some distance, right? In an unconnected, manner.
I experienced that state is almost like you're looking through and trying to find where the lines overlap. It's like they're both mazes and you're trying to, rotate around them such that you can actually fit. And sometimes that takes, a very long time, but it's a background process.
Yeah, absolutely. And oftentimes I found like the thing that actually connects the dots is some totally little disparate piece of information that you encounter along the way. And it actually calls back to something that you remember, but that you hadn't been considering. It's like subconscious memory oftentimes has that key, and it's something kind of unrelated that'll trigger that. But that's kind of where I started from. And, I just kind of, there's a commitment there. You have to just be willing to be juggling things. And, that means that when you have conversations like this, you can't come out and say, this is the way. It's like, well, these are the patterns that I see, and this is how I see them lining up. I'm not sure where they're going, but it seems to go this direction. And John has, I think, probably the most sophisticated model I've encountered for what he appropriately termed, I think, in his conversation with Lex Friedman the other day, a way of finding meaning in the world or in life, right? And not meaning of life, which is a critical distinction and, valid for sure, but problematic at the same time, because it limits the range of options to the material world, in a sense. And that's not a place to find answers, I don't think. Not when we live in a relativistic space and everything's, subjectively oriented, in a sense.
Well, almost because there is a function that can search deeper than that, it will. And so ultimately, meaning in life can be very satisfying to certain parts of our process, but there is another part of our process that continue to search. And if you're never going there, then you're never going to be fulfilled there as well.
And this is where I think Donald Hoffman really nails it, because he gives a model of, why we have to go outside. Like, I think, I don't know if I know anyone who articulates that better, of just based on the scientific evidence of the conflicts in the theories that we have, the reasons why we can't find a point to anchor anything within the material world. But what he doesn't, or he begins to posit, I'll say, is a direction to go outside. But, in John's words, right, the combinatorially explosive nature of the question of, like, which direction do you go if you begin to go outside of the material world, means that we need to get it fairly close, or we're going to be floundering a long time.
And one thing that I would just add on top of that argument, that is something that always bothers me, is like, okay, if we're going to take as our starting point always the material world and what we can make sense of within that, I don't think you ever get a good case being made for the emergence of more and more complex patterns over time. That necessarily presupposes that there is something going on outside of the material. Am I wrong about that? I don't understand how you possibly get a development of complexification and higher life forms over time.
Let me try to tie back, because I'm still trying to answer Steve's question about constraints. So,
Aaron, you always do this, man. We go on these crazy rabbit holes.
Well, the problem that I constantly encounter, that I kind of tried to bring up before, is that, without a context in which to present information, then it's hard to bring everybody together, right? Totally. You and I have been together on this the whole way, in a sense.
Yeah.
Steve's gotten kind of your perspective in to some degree over the past, 6 months or so, 9 months, maybe you guys have been talking. So
don't worry, just keep going.
So anyhow, I'm sitting in my shop working along, right? And I'm listening to Akira the Dawn, some of his Alan Watts albums. And, Watts has this line where he says, every one of us is an aperture through which the whole cosmos looks out. And then there's another line that comes from Carl Sagan that is, let me think. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. You know, it's something like this. To me, that gave me some directionality in my thinking about, like, where do you start to stand if you're going to stand outside of the material world and try to develop a context for how to relate to it in relation to whatever else there is, in a sense, without a way of, or without the necessity of trying to define everything. Because, you know, the problem that we've historically always encountered is that we run into things that require terms like infinite to describe, that we don't have ways to think about. You know, it's like you start to use a word that we sort of like, we use it, we have functional ways to use it, but we don't have ways to conceptualize it. And so one of the things that came to my mind was that that there seems to be a hierarchy of constraints in place. And if you start to think about some of these fundamental constraints that we encounter in the material world, you know, we describe them as something like natural laws. You know, we use physics to describe them, like standard model physics to describe them. And they're the kind of things that you can't, you ignore them at your peril. And in some way, they're just ultimately convincing. You jump, you fall. And it's like, it doesn't matter how enlightened you feel yourself to be at the time, gravity still works. And then I was thinking about artificial constraints, because what we seem to encounter in our experience as humans, a significant amount of the time, especially now, is that we encounter a world that's full of artificial constraints. And I mean, to unbelievable degrees of complexity. Even the things that we've developed, we don't understand. Within the financial system, this is everywhere. We have a brother who's he's a manager of a fund that does hedge fund tax accounting, or a firm that does tax accounting. And, you know, he has exposure to all kinds of different industries that are extremely niche financial market operators. And like, they barely know the little slice of what they do. And people outside of it don't have any idea how it works. Mm-hmm. And our system's full of these kind of things everywhere, and people trying to arbitrage them, all kinds of stuff. And so, you know, I'm constantly working within this framework where, you know, we're dealing with the reality we find ourselves in today, where it's post-enlightenment, you know, and we've got science progressed to the point where it is today, and we've got all of these tools and with high utility, and you can't just toss that out the window. Like, that was, you know, this is the tension that's been there between the religious and science argument, and it's been increasing and growing for the most part for the last couple hundred years. It's like, you know, you end up at these points where it's either you take this one and you discard this one, or vice versa. Or you determine to live within the world with some sort of a tension internally unreconciled. You know, it's like, well, I'm a Christian in 2020 and I still believe the Bible. I don't know what to do with all those parts that seem to be obviously not accurate, but I have to, or I can't. It's like I have to believe them somehow, or I have to at least allow them, or I have to go on like extreme gyrations of, mental exercise to develop some story for them, to bring them, to make them relevant. And at the end of the day, you just end up unsatisfied and unreconciled and at tension internally. And I think realistically, like that's pretty much the reality that everyone in the Western world's experienced for the last few hundred years. Because without a way to reconcile these conflicts of, the apparent, obvious, convincing reality that we encounter all the time, and like you said, the also convincing reality that it's not sufficient, like the answers aren't there. Mm-hmm. Like, well, we need a way to reconcile these things in a way to be able to think about them together. And so I started looking back, and it's like, when you analyze some of the, ancient texts and all of those stories, and this is where Jordan Peterson was really helpful to me. His biblical lecture series helped me to recontextualize the way that I approached, early scriptural writing. That was, very helpful, because if, again, if you don't have ways to fit the information together in a way that makes sense, then you end up just kind of like holding it somehow. It takes a lot of energy. And, like, I think when your energy is being expended doing that, like your attention is not in the present, like it's distracting for sure. And that's, that's probably had a large impact on the reality we all experience today on a collective level.
Well, I think so I was looking when back, it's that hard to hold things up. A lot of times what people will do is they'll say it's not worth it, not worth the energy cost, and they'll drop it. And what they're dropping in at that moment is their conscious awareness. They're literally allowing their own awareness to shrink so that they don't have to expend the energy to hold the scale of that problem that you're discussing.
Yeah, it's like narrowing of, your input, and just like a structural rigidity that you add to your frame. It's like any new information that comes in that doesn't fit just has to be discarded.
Yes.
And so I, obviously am trying to figure out what were people talking about when they're talking about God, and what are we talking about when we're talking about God? How are those things different? How did people find a utility in the past, or meaning beyond, meaning of life? Because it's apparent that that's been achieved multiple times in the past, at different levels of resolution, in a sense. And the pattern does seem to be that, it continues to increase in complexity, and, it replicates a pattern further out over time, and you see a greater and greater embodiment over time. Something like this progression of like Adam, Noah, Moses, David, Christ. It's like you see different archetypes that kind of progressively more and more embody the being in the human being duality. Because it seems to me that, this is something that's inescapable to us, is that we experience life in this duality, in this dual frame of reference kind of experience. It's like, what is the part of you that watches the other part of you do a thing and approves or disapproves of it, or
watches that.
So it's like, well, what is that, and where does it come from, and how is it that we all experience that, and all of so. And I mean, a lot of this stuff, once the ball started rolling for me with the idea of constraints, I started talking to Kenny about it, and we're going back and forth, and we kind of arrived at a little bit of a definition for where we wanted to start at the bottom for an idea of like what is being. And we determined, again, you end up resorting to these terms like infinite, and I think you have to allow it, because I don't think you could build a model about something like this and apply definitions without being truly hubristic. Like, it's the pinnacle of arrogance to think you could define, whatever's holding this all up. It's like we're so far from even resolving the conflicts that we experience in our own material world that we don't even have a great way to start there. So we decided to start with being at the bottom and call that something like infinite awareness, and place that within infinite potential with something like infinite energy. So you equate those two, you can equate them in a Father, Son, Holy Spirit kind of aspect. The energy aspect, I would say, is what we call the logos, right? Or the word. It's the communication protocol that you have to have. And, this is another idea that I got from Watts was, that the only thing that the infinite lacks is a way to know itself. Everything else is already a given, in a sense, to the infinite, right? Except there's no representation of the infinite in that sense, of awareness. And so the only way to express the pattern of awareness is to implement artificial constraints. Because once you implement a constraint and then you have the logos, like, that can go out and hit it and come back, right? Then you have a referential mechanism that you can begin to establish. And when constraints are applied, let's say in a layer form, you achieve higher resolution every time you implement a new layer of constraint. And I think this is what we experience in space-time. If you compose space as infinite potential, and you start at the beginning of time with awareness, and you see, as through the progression of time, essentially, like, the logos goes out and it encounters constraint at the edge of time as it's expanding into space, and it fixes matter. Like, material gets fixed by that communication, right? That attention that extends from the being, from awareness out into potential. It fixes the matter and returns. And this is the way in which the infinite can begin to know itself. Now, obviously, if you start with something like the lowest resolution constraint, and you start to layer up more and more constraints, then it becomes necessary, right, that every constraint provides, some sort of a utility that replicates the base pattern of being. Because there's obviously artifacts where, the true nature of being is not reflected all the way through to our material reality, for sure.
Well, and for no other reason than the actual reason for the creation of the constraint by its creator becomes nullified, right? If for no other reason than that, it's a problem. Like artifact becomes an issue simply because it is creating a separation within the pattern of being itself.
It'd be a distortion, and I mean, we can, I think we can kind of contextualize it in different ways that have utility as far as how we approach maybe resolving things that are artifacts.
Wait, real quick, Steve, where are you at? Do you have any questions or things you wanted to bring in?
I'm going to have 7,000 things I could say, but I've understood everything so far. So
okay.
Well, that's amazing, actually. So,
I mean, I'm not very surprised.
We're off to a good start.
I'm not very surprised. I feel like where Steve's at, I was like, I wanted to make sure though.
Yeah, I mean, it's critical because, that at the end of the day, what we're trying to work on is a functional model, that gives us utility and allows us to apply the tools that we're constantly developing, as humans in ways that are actually practical and relevant and like pragmatic. That's, I tend to be pretty pragmatic in my approach. It's served me well in many ways, and I wouldn't base everything in pragmatism, but it's a high utility mode of being. So it's something that I'd love to have any holes punched in, obviously, because we just want to refine and make it better. And actually, maybe that's just a matter of like continuing to refine context and definitions and determine where to position things relative to each other. And, Kenny and I have, I would say, kind of been getting to the point of formalizing some of these ideas for a month or so. And I think we've both found a lot of utility in applying this model to our everyday interactions with the world. And so that gives me some encouragement that, there's something here that we can use. So I don't know, Kenny, should I add more to that or do?
Well, so maybe we should tie it in with so maybe I'll talk a little bit from here because you've kind of built the base model, and now like moving upwards towards how it applies to your actual day-to-day living. That when you have this layering on of constraints, you might say that through time, evolution is actually the movement of being into space by means of time, and the creation of higher and higher levels of constraint mechanisms that create more and more complex feedback loops, which creates something like ever increasing consciousness.
And it adds something like a complexity to the fractal reflection of the patterns.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So then you have the arrival of human beings onto the space, which is something like the ability of the awareness which is behind on one side to see through and within and without. Right? It's the ability, it's the jump, it's the hyper jump of the awareness to be able to look within and through the pattern itself in all directions, to the infinite zero and to the infinite non-being and to the infinite being.
It's something like embedded awearness or embedded consciousness, something like that.
And so what you have in now, I don't know in terms of lower levels of consciousness below humans. I'm hesitant to talk about some of those things in terms of where they fall in the level of awareness feeding back in itself, and if it's possible for them to distort that feedback. Because what I think is important is that at each level of constraint, the reflected agape, right? Because it's really, agape is the provision of awareness to generate a field of constraint. to the next level to generate the next level of constraint. And upon that level of constraint, a reflection pattern can happen. And so as you move up and up and up, because it's a pyramid like everything is, as you move up and up, you get something like refraction and reflection of agape up and down, which is simply something like being in action, because it's awareness in action, providing space for itself and of. And so once you get to human beings, the particular and the special aspect of human beings within the constraints of embeddedness is the ability to abstract. And what it means to abstract is not to take something and make it non-real. It means to take a specific pattern out of the whole and then look at it as a whole itself. So we're embedded in the whole. We can't approach the whole. Therefore, any distinction of constraint patterns within our embedded awareness is an abstraction. So anything we conceptualize in our model becomes an abstract layer of constraint, which can feed back on itself and start to create the pattern all over it. So properly functioning, what a human being does is provide another layer of agape space in which the entirety of the universe can reformulate into that pattern of being. And this happens at the deepest level of the self that almost no one actually ever gets to, because it's so deep in the unconscious. Because
their own identity is actually one of those layers that they're operating through, and you have to see the through line to notice that that's not the ultimate.
Yes, exactly. And so most of us are stuck very, very high in our own abstracted levels of constraints. And this is the thing about artificial constraint. Every constraint within the abstract space is artificial. Every constraint in the abstract space is artificial. Thus, every constraint in the abstract space must be held with a very open hand. And this is where the intake of data and the reformation of the conceptual pattern are so important, because
relevance realization is critical right there,
And relevance realization is always tied to the point at which there's attention held through time. So as Aaron was talking about earlier, right, you're holding two things that don't make sense. And if you're trying to hold them and force them to stay apart instead of just allowing them to fully be, right, it takes energy instead of agape. And then your relevance realization is tied to that space. And this is sin, and this creates a negative reflection or refraction pattern down through the levels of being.
It also, I think, that another thing that seemed to illustrate really clearly with this model is that, disintegrated information from your past is really like these are the sources that keep your attention from being present in the moment. It's like the tendency is either it's generally towards fear, and either that's, going to pull your attention towards the future, right? And you worry, which pointless. And then, or it's constantly pulling you to the past where you have something that's unreconciled, right? And this could be, the way that you framed a story to yourself, knowing that that wasn't the way it actually happened, and like anytime you introduce attention into your life, like this is why, lying is such a sin, right? Like this is the problem with the lie fundamentally, right? Is that it introduces this tension between the optimal pattern of being, in a sense, being reflected, and you have to continually maintain that tension, that artifact, into the future. The only way that twist in the story continues is if you maintain it. But as long as it continues to engage your attention, the future creation is occurring constantly as we're, encountering space through time, in a sense, right? It's like our attention is creating everything around us all the time, or the attention of being, in a sense, is, and we're participating in that. And we seem to have the ability to even participate intentionally. And, to the degree that we're able to resolve and reconcile all of the conflicts that keep us out of that space where we can actually participate in the present moment. So like this is the real, I think the real power of this in a practical sense is like, here's a framework and a context within which individuals can experience I say context, call it logical, maybe it won't be in a sense, but like a story that you can tell that gives you a space where you can actually apply agape in your relationship with yourself, like the dual aspects of yourself, the being and the human, which, reference to Ian McGilchrist here, like I think he's done amazing work in the hemispherical structures of the brain, and they're, I hesitate to go all the way to the point of saying like right brain is being and the left brain is just pattern recognition, human, developing a personality and developing, a subjective perspective of the world, right? And like, to the degree that you go left brain, you're not engaging novel information like your right brain is intended to do, or like you can really allocate a lot of things this way. The only time you get anything that really works properly is when it's really balanced, right? Like that's optimal. And in a scenario like that, I think that's something like being providing relevance realization for the pattern recognition machine that's deploying attention, right? Like as your attention is deployed and you're constantly recursively trying to determine where should it be going and how much attention do I need to put into it and all these things. The only way you can actually create the pattern of being in the future and bring it into reality through this process of creation is if the being is doing the relevance realization. Otherwise, your tendency is constantly going to be projecting through your pattern recognition structure, which is at the end of the day, like if you've broken that connection, right? If there's some tension between the being and the human pattern recognition machine, it's a result of a tension and an artifact that's unresolved between them. It's like you've been dishonest with yourself. You need to approach that honestly, apply some agape, reconcile it with yourself and however else it needs to be reconciled so that you can participate in, the creation of the future, through like with the ability to deploy agape. Because otherwise, whatever pattern that you create is going to be a distortion. Yeah. And every time we implement a distortion, it creates an artifact that blocks the true pattern from expanding into space, right? To being materialized. And, like this has provided a framework where we can look at things like, what's it talk about when Christ goes into hell and conquers death? Like, are there artifacts at different layers of constraints that we can actually go back and resolve with the proper kind of orientation and attention? Because that's kind of the implication in that story, is that, many of the constraints that we, like the human body is a great way to think about constraints. And I think Kenny finds this is a really good way to connect some of these ideas with the people that he meets without trying to build this whole model for them. When you meet people that are ill or near the end of their life, they're experiencing constraints in their physical experience like they haven't before, and often with pain, but certainly constrained, not able to operate and do the things that they used to be able to do, maybe want to be able to do. Like, there's a necessity that's built into us to adapt. you can't ignore those kind of things, right? Or if you do, you end up like really disintegrated, right? This tension and this, anytime you have that, it's a disintegration process. It's like, then they don't even know how to like relate to themselves. And then often if it's like they're facing, you know, a fearful experience like death, you know, they're in no position to encounter that at all. And it seems to me that like without most of these constraints, we'd have very little of the information that we have today. You know, our body's constrained in so many ways. Our you know, the waveforms that we're able to process through our visual systems or our auditory systems, and, you know, like all of the sensory input that we're able to utilize in our building our perception of the world are constrained necessarily, and they're uniquely constrained because each one of us inhabits a unique and different body. And whenever you work with people who have, you know, say color blindness, if you do graphic design and, or, you know, you need graphic work done and you work with people who are colorblind, you have to compensate for that, you know, because it's a constraint that we don't have an artificial solution for, in a sense. And, you know, you can look around us and see how many amazing artificial solutions we've developed. You know, eyeglasses are a great example, hearing aids, prosthetics, like amazing innovation that we do in actually decreasing the constraints that we encounter in or experience in our encounters with the material world. But those are actually the intake mechanisms for our feedback loops.
Yeah.
And I mean, they're specialized, and they're like, we have to kind of hold that in our model as well, right? It's like, we're very special. And I'm not sure that in our perception of the embedding of consciousness in the human, that we're talking about an instantaneous type of process. You know, this seems to actually be an incremental process that's occurring over time. You know, that, you know,
well, there's a way in which we're working backwards across the abstracted knowledge layer filter. Because if you take evolution seriously, then, you know, we're just finally now really starting to understand the potential of what we are. Whereas, you know, like, I don't take the Adam and Eve story all that seriously from a historical standpoint. Steve, I wanted to hear what you were I'm interested to hear how this model overlays for you a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, like I said, so many ways to jump into that, but I appreciate it. That was very helpful to understand some of the things you said before as well, with the necessity of constraints and how it's not like they're some inconvenience that it's like, oh, we wish we didn't have that. It's like,
right,
literally reality itself unfolding from potential has to create constraints as it does so.
We tend to think of them as negative.
Right, which is not the case. I mean,
no.
Literally for something to be, it has to not be something else, and it has to constrain what can be around it, or it doesn't have any properties.
Yep.
So in order for something to even exist, it has to have an influence on what can be around it, or what that relationship it will have with what is around it. So that actually was very helpful for me to understand, yeah, your sense of the word constraint. I would probably use my analogy of the Sudoku puzzle, where basically if the whole universe, all of reality, the Sudoku puzzle, as you put in numbers, hopefully they're accurate, and those are like I think you call them real constraints, and artificial constraints are guesses you're making towards filling in the puzzle that might not be accurate. But you actually have to take those leaps and produce those artificial constraints so that you can get the feedback of, hey, did that work? And oftentimes you won't figure out the answer until you get much, much further on and realize, wow, really have to change a lot of these numbers because I've got, different, I can't triangulate. I can't reach truth in all of my processes with that, which is what agape allows for.
I think that's actually a really appropriate metaphor because, I mean, that is what we are doing all the time as humans. If we're oriented the right way, is like, you'll impose a constraint. You can look at this in like a civilizational way. Like, our civilizations are constraint hierarchies. And, we've over time iterated on those based on the feedback as well as we could, gather it and fit it into an existing model. And then we'll try again and, implement a different type of artificial constraints and run it again. And like, yeah, that's what we're doing all the time. And like, you won't know what doesn't work. Like you said, you can't even start to fill out the squares until you put some of those limiting, constraining factors in some of the other empty ones.
And this is, this is how evolution works. Evolution is a giant Sudoku puzzle running on random, right? And that's the difference between an NPC.
Well, within maybe not random, but within, a defined constraint structure.
Right. Like, I mean, it has maybe it's large constraints that it's running on that are, the hard constraints to start with. But then within that, like the evolution of life of a species and the differentiation within that, it's running, but it's kind of, but it can't abstract itself, right? And this is the difference in being a human being versus just being a human. If you're just a human and you're not really being, then you're just running constraint patterns. And you're just running out the constraint pattern that somebody else built to see if it works.
Or just the one that you've established from your limited experience.
But that's not even real, right? Because you can think that you're running your own original, but really, you're running some half version of Nietzsche and Marx and, whoever else, right? That's why the philosophers are the wizards, right? Because they're the ones writing the code that everybody else is running. And everybody else is just like, hey, like we're really trying out the Jean-Paul Sartre code right now. And I mean, there are some people who are being in that code and they're really trying to, be real players in that code. I think that maybe is a negative way of being, but that's because of my particular standpoint on that code. That being said, I think this is one of the ways in which you really go, in which you can really understand where you are in your own life is, am I really being, in the sense that I'm happening to the ideas as they're playing on my consciousness. Like they're not just playing on my consciousness.
Yeah, this is something that you're connecting a lot of dots here for me because, I really think of the mind as a space-time interface. And the reason I think of it that way is because of what we're talking about, because of the way that reality steps itself forward from potential to reality. And the way that's what we do. That's how we create our own identity and our sense of self is we put forward something that has real constraints mixed with artificial constraints, test it in the world, and then look back at how that went. And that's the constant process of being aware. And so that's why I used time, or what I've come to call super space time or time space, which is the thing that contains space time. So it's sort of the context that where the space time is the contents. This is the contextual space. I think the transcendental process gets you into the contextual space where the content, you see that you're a continual production of content, but you also see that you are not that content ever. You may allow that content to run you and to operate you, and you do. But so I think what we're talking about here is how the universe unfolds and also how our minds unfolds and how those things are deeply connected. And Sin, one of the things was really interesting to me, you're talking about basically how our blindness builds up and has an interest cost to it. So whenever we are not in an agapic space, we're producing errors in our model. And then we have to pay the cost of holding all of the energy of that tension, of that because we ultimately know the truth. This is something that I really connect with more and more these days, is that whether you yourself, your conscious presence, is in the place of agapic integration or not, it's still happening. Because how else could you know when you hear it? How else could you realize, or how else could you even feel that tension and that energy? So this is a process that's going on, and you can participate in it or not, but it's still going to happen. And if you don't participate in it, you're going to feel like you are underneath it. And
Right.
that is a crushing place to be, especially as your life goes on and you spend a lot of time maintaining your shell.
Well, and yeah, I mean, like, I use this illustration, it's like a rubber band. If you take a band and you twist it between 2 points and you continue to twist it, as you induce tension, there becomes a point where you actually can't stop pushing. It's not like you can just hold it. You have to keep twisting it, because any sort of a release and the thing will just snap.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the beauty of a model like this, or something like this, right, is that now there's a context for self-forgiveness, because you're actually going to need it all the time. That's what recursive relevance realization is going to be showing you, is that the last iteration you just ran had flaws. If you can't forgive yourself for running an iteration with flaws, then you can't integrate the new information that you just received from that.
Yes.
Yeah. So, okay, because this is where I wanted to go next, was let's existentialize this, right? Because this is a great theory and it's powerful. But like, one of the things, and I've been talking to you about this a little bit, Aaron, is that I've been struggling with recently, is like, life's just been really hectic and busy for a few weeks, and here and there, I don't even know what they were anymore, but I felt like I had a bad attitude, or I said something, or something happened, or whatever, and I started say, judging myself. And then one of the things that I noticed that was happening once I started to try to extricate myself is that I was having to like build a platform from one version of myself to judge the other version of myself. But then immediately my next move was to say, oh, I'm judging myself right now, that needs to stop, and now I'm somewhere else judging that version of myself. And I created this like whole recursive loop that was mostly upset at myself for judging myself. And
shame of shame.
Yeah. And that, like, I know theoretically how to break that, like it's repentance and it's agape, and it's that whole thing of like showing agape towards myself and moving back into the present moment. But it's so difficult for me to actually existentialize sometimes. So I'm curious on both of your responses to that.
I really resonated with, I think, one of the descriptions that Aaron was putting out there, which was that Jesus is the reconciliation. And so if you're thinking of ultimate reconciliation in every moment, I think that's actually a lot closer to the willingness to feel the totality of your shame in every moment. Because I think being willing to go that far is effectively what stops it from cycling on itself. So it's a way of letting it pass through you so totally that even your resistance to resistance can't catch you. So I guess it's the totalness of surrender that I'm suggesting, really, that allows for integration to take place, because you can come up with the most complicated meta issue, and the spiritual ego is like based on doing this constantly, right? But ultimately, all of them will be the resistance of your own resistance. And I think that's the spot that certainly catches me all the time as well, too. Like, I wish I wasn't feeling this, right? I should know better, or whatever else it is. And you're you're creating two versions of yourself just to beat up the one that you think you currently are. But for no reason at all are you saying you're this one versus the one that knows better and is punching down, who actually probably should know better. You can just keep cycling that.
Well, when we were talking about this the other day, and Kenny mentioned this to me, I mean, one of my responses was that, I think this was one of the most brilliant aspects of Jesus' example, was that he consistently refused to be a judge. That, I mean, the entire mindset was foreign. The desire, the willingness, maybe the ability, in a sense. It's like, because if you can get beyond this framework where you're limited by entropy and things like that, right? Like, every mistake is a cost. Then there's actually no reason to judge anybody and no reason to judge yourself.
It's directly counterproductive
and
you and them all.
Right. And I think the frame like that you just described is a good way to think about how we should relate to ourselves ongoing, because it is the case that, at least seems to be the way our brains work, that things will reoccur to you that presents you with a disintegration in your experience that previously you was not in your conscious awareness. It's like a thing from your past. Like, one day you're good, and 2 days later this thing pops up. It's like that thing didn't just happen.
Yeah.
It's been there.
Yeah.
So the reality is, though, that it's as soon as it presents itself to you, you have another opportunity to either reconcile or introduce disintegration into your experience. Even though it's
really layer them on if you keep judging yourself, right?
And this is why it's like, it's so effective if you can just try. I mean, because I have the same challenges. It's like this is the human experience. Is a great example for me is driving. Like I view driving on public roads as an amazing thing. It's incredible that people are able to do it at all. It's quite a testament to social cohesion, in a sense. And really, most of the time, the ability and willingness to follow basic laws and rules. But it's clear that most people don't spend nearly as much attention driving as I do. And I mean, there's reasons for that. I've had a Class A CDL since I was 18. I've been driving heavy trucks, and I've driven race cars, and it's like I had more exposure than a lot of people to the feedback of driving. And, that gives me an awareness about the situation. That means that I'm always hyper attentive while I'm driving. And in a sense, that's stressful. It's definitely, the more attentive you are while you're driving, go drive through a snowstorm for 10 hours. Like, you'll know how stressful it is to just exert that much attention and focus it so diligently. And, so then I'm in a position where I'm constantly observing all these people paying very little attention around me. I'm aware of the risks that imposes and all this sort of thing. So it's an incredibly frustrating thing for me. I see people doing things wrong. Every 5 miles, it's like 10 people, right? It's like, so it's one of the most frustrating things I do. I encounter all the time. And it's a constant opportunity for me to try to deploy some kind of, mechanism of awareness and, check my, because this, my pattern recognition machine runs wild, right? When I'm watching these people paying this attention, right? Driving, because, driving requires a lot of pattern recognition, constant processing. because you have to adapt and react and respond very quickly sometimes. Not very often, but sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's a clear and present conflict for me. Whenever I engage it, at this point, I just accept it. And so I just try to be aware of it before I start. Even
So
if
for you, it's an issue of you setting up versions of yourself to judge other drivers. Is that the first step? Or like,
well, that's subconscious. Like that I'll do by myself.
yeah,
Right. Like if I just let myself go,
yeah, exactly.
that's exactly where it goes into pure judgment.
Right. So
Right.
that's the
It's
first
like
step. And then
everybody's basically an idiot.
yeah. And then
And the
start
reality is
rehearsing
probably
about
most
that.
of them aren't paying that much attention.
Yeah.
It's not that they're idiots or anything like that. It's like they're distracted or this or the other thing. But, it's like you project all these things instantly. And
well, just to tie a lot of that to what we were talking about before, I think that's probably largely true of culture as well and where we're at. I don't think it's that people are as dumb as they seem at certain times. It's that they can't pay the cost of paying attention.
it may just be because we're so disintegrated.
Exactly.
Right.
Yep.
Everyone at scale is so disintegrated. And I think a lot of that is because there's no context to resolve some of these ideas that, people are convinced of, most people, whether they can codify their religious ideas or spiritual ideas or not, they're real to them. And they're also, it's uncontroversial that, the material world is a part of our existence, right? So the tools that we use to explain and reduce and function in this world or in this constraint tier of reality are, it's all necessary. This is something we talked about this morning, Kenny. It's like the challenge becomes, and this is the Gnostic versus sort of nihilistic dichotomy, is that, it's like, which one is more real? That's the question that's posed between those two options, right?
Yeah.
Are you going to stick yourself in the material reality and limit that to your definition of reality to the material world and devolve into nihilism? Or are you going to deny that as, fundamental and take something else as more fundamental beyond it, and therefore like kind of deny the necessity of participation at this level in a sense? And the fundamental problem with this, with all of that, is that there's no differentiation of reality. It's not like there's more real and less real. It's actually all real. Even the abstractions that human beings create into our experience are real.
Yeah.
We experience them as real, but that doesn't make this the most real. It doesn't make, like you're saying, once you go outside space-time, you compose a space like super space-time. It's like, it doesn't make that more real. It's maybe a lower level constraint structure, like lower resolution. There's few constraints, so there's almost no resolution maybe. And then within the constraint structures that are nested inside of that, you get increasing layers of resolution as constraints are applied.
I think I've seen a lot of conversations around this, like the primacy of material or consciousness. That seems to be the dichotomy that a lot of people have. And like, I think it's kind of a non-starter. I think it's kind of a bad question. I think it's like asking about free will. It's like, well, it's contingent, each is contingent upon the other. So I think from the space of, like, when you're going to build arguments via propositions, you have to start with awareness, because it's the lowest space that you can go to within yourself. But if we didn't have the material, awareness would be just undifferentiated. It would just be, the singularity point before the Big Bang, which is being and non-being together. So it's like it's a non-starter space on some level, because as soon as you have being that is separated from non-being, you have the interpenetration of the material and consciousness.
Yeah, I think for me, how do I put this? I'm at a space now where it's almost so clear that they're not in conflict that it's hard to reach back to that point of conflict. But I do see that a lot of people are talking about that all the time. But I don't think you can be confused about that from an agapic space. I think entering a transcendental process actually is the resolution of contradiction. Of paradox from contradiction into superposition, where things can be overlaid on top of each other, but they have different momentum. So there actually is a difference between them, but you're lacking a dimension with which to view it from.
Yeah, and it's a level of analysis issue.
Yeah, it is an over prioritization of logical thinking, and not recognizing appropriately the bounds of logical thinking and how it needs to fit itself within both our feelings and our awareness. Yeah, it's sort of like we live in a fractal, and if you try and build a staircase in a fractal, a rigid staircase, you're never going to be able to actually do the loop. You can create it locally in a small way, but it actually has to exist. The way I would fundamentally say it is that you can't separate something unless there's something that is unseparated underneath it. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And to be confused about that, you have to be trying to start from a place where you're creating through separation, which is just an inversion of the entirety of reality. There has to be an undivided whole that you then separate. So unity has to start that way, and the constraints come out of that. So for me, what's most fundamental is self-reference, which is recursion, and change. And if you have a frame that starts from self-reference and change, you don't run into that problem, because things loop back on themselves naturally. That's in fact what evolution is doing. That's what everything is doing. It's just a slight variation of self constrained against all of else that is self. And so for me, that's why I like awareness and then the process of time flow back into each other very naturally through the material world. So I think that basically flip your entire perspective of reality upside down to get out of that problem. I don't think there's any other way out of that problem.
Yeah. One of the things that I thought about when you were explaining that is I'm reading the D.C. Schindler's book, Plato's Critique of Impure Reason right now. And John and Robert Breedlove are doing a just fantastic set of conversations on that book. But one of the things that he brings out right away is this issue of the reduction of reason to computation. And John talks about this a lot in their conversation. But when we perceive reason and reasonability, I mean, we base everything off reason, whether we're a skeptic who holds many things as if they don't matter, whether they're intentional or not, you still will claim reasons for why you believe in skepticism. Like you claim reasonability for everything, but it's seen as a means to an end. And thus it's a rigid staircase to nowhere, because it necessarily requires you to start from a space of differentiation as your ground of being. Because all you can do from a computational perspective is divide things. Like you can add them together after you've divided them, but you have to have them divided into categories before you can multiply them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in some sense, I actually think we may be closer than it seems because of how absurd things are getting. I think that almost the truth comes when you're furthest from it because of the hyperbolic nature of nature, pretty much. So I think that we're hopefully approaching a place where this starts to make more sense, because so little of what we're doing is making sense, and there's so much danger in where we're headed that I think these things will combine to the place as they did for me, like where you have to be willing to pay any cost to turn that awareness back on, because the only alternative is death, and just for the whole species. So I think that we're getting to the place where that inversion, that flip, they talk about the Earth's magnetic field, how it flips every once in a while. I don't know much about that, but that's kind of what I think the human species needs to do, is completely flip its understanding of reality to the point where they realize that these tensions are actually due to artificial constraints and not natural ones.
Yeah. Well,
how do we do that?
Well, that's, I think it's through memes, probably.
Yeah, sure.
Honestly, like McKinney and I talk about this a lot, because one of my most persistent critiques of most of the content that I even ingest is that it's relatively inaccessible in a sense, without a fairly developed vocabulary and quite a bit of groundwork, depending on where you're coming from. The likelihood that someone who's say had a relatively institutional type experience within our society is going to just instantly be able to catch the critical points.
Yeah. Watch this conversation and know anything about what we're talking about.
Well, if hopefully we're doing well enough explaining it to lower the threshold some degree.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day,
but it is a flip. It really is a flip of reality. I think that's the right way to say it, Steve. It's like it really is a full inversion of everything you think you are and everything you think reality is.
Well, you are on that loop that has to flip. I think that you have to flip around twice in your mind, basically, to unravel it.
Yeah, I was listening to a Terence McKenna interview today, and he's talking about the guy had crazy ideas all over the place, but I find a lot of synergy with many of them, not all of them, but he mentioned the idea in the discussion today about attractors, right? That it's not necessarily, as we explore space, there's a tendency to apply the rule of gravity as the fundamental kind of power of mass in a sense, and but the theory of attractors as maybe a better way to conceptualize this, right? Like it actually does work in that kind of recursive sense where it's self-reflective all the time, right? It's going out and coming back. And that's something like the logos in a sense, right? It always, like, everything flows back that direction as well. We see it, we experience it like it's expanding. That's the way that we model the universe. That's the way we experience time into space, all of these things. But like actually all the information is self-referential, and in that regards, like that flow that's going out is going back in equally, because the state has to be reflected back.
And there's almost like the containment of the higher orders within the lower orders as they're experiencing dilation, something like that.
Mm-hmm. And one thing you were talking about when you're talking about evolution, you were talking about how these things unfold. And I think it all comes down to basically efficiency of potential in an interesting way that I would love to. I'm going to work towards the cultural level and then get your guys' thoughts. Because on the physical level, all particles are under a certain amount of pressure based on the situation around them, and they're allowed to kind of expand and change based on when heat or other things change that pressure situation, and then they change what they're doing. And then evolution is kind of the same thing. It tries mutations, attempts things, and whatever is more effective at allocating, gathering resources, and reproducing itself continues. So in a certain sense, whatever can continue does. And that's a way to simplify evolution and physics into like one kind of through line process. And then you get to culture, and I haven't brought that analogy myself there, but I'm curious, what is the whatever can continue will continue on culture? Because on some level, you see this war of language that's happening, and people, I think, are realizing that words do make up a lot of culture. They're not the only part of it, but what else, or how do we change the situation so that's a more cooperative process? How do we have a more lossless conversion of truth and love in culture from potential?
So I've been thinking about this a lot, and I've brought this idea up before. I think
I was going to say the same thing. I've been thinking about this a lot.
About how, right? Like the question, I think it fundamentally comes down to red pill or blue pill. In that, what it means to be human, properly speaking, is that you are a real player in the updating of the abstract frame as such over time. In order to be, the amount to which you are being is the amount to which real feedback from the hard constraints that you experience in your body is properly integrated into the abstract layer which you are reflecting to others. That's the degree to which being can come through this frame and into the collective abstract space of culture. Now, to the degree that you're a non-real player is the degree to which you are disconnected. Your real hard feedback into your interface machine is misrepresented. So even if that's just small data loss because of your own disintegrations, that's unfortunate. But if you're actually intentionally misrepresenting and manipulating the within yourself and in your projection to others, you create a loss space in which you create a misadaptation of the collective abstract from the collective experiential or existential. And that lost space literally, it literally is like I love the word dukkha, right? Mm-hmm. That it's the grinding of the wheel that pulls you off the tightrope of what can be, will be. And so I think, that I think the answer is only just to wake people up. Because otherwise, I think what will always eventually happen is that the hard constraints always win. And because they're lower order, they're the ones that exist at a lower level of agape, right? It's through the agape of the material that our abstract is provided. Afforded, yes. And so, it will tear down that which is held up through false space. So I would say that to be human and not being is to run the old standard evolutionary protocol on your being and on your DOSing, which is just to say, you're going to just run whatever code you're given and see where it takes you. Versus real being, where now you're a real player constantly integrating data, and you're alive. Otherwise, you're dead. You're just running something that is not your own. You're imprisoned by the man of sin, as Paul would say.
So maybe the most negative, and I mean that in a very specific way, I'll get to, but the most negative interpretation of this is that every moment of sin, every moment of non-pure awareness is your own spiritual death for that moment. And you can revive yourself, but you're continually dying spiritually to not be aware through the avoidance of pain effectively.
But
your own soul.
The unwillingness to honestly address some artifact of disintegration in your experience that's entered your awareness. And I think
space gets harder to get to the more it builds up.
Yeah.
This
in the grand scheme of things, sorry, Aaron, I want to let you talk, but in the grand scheme of things, this is the redemption of Christ for all being, is that like somehow the movement of Christ down into hell and back up again redeems that negative space, even for the worst players. I think, but
yeah, and I would love to get back to that with the most positive version, because I think that's what Christ is supposed to represent. So anyway, go ahead, Aaron.
When I'm thinking about evolution, the terms you defined, I would like to also add that it's, it's adaptive within a dynamic constraint system, because the terms of the selection process are changing constantly. It's like the earth changes, climate changes or something. Like the type of animals or genetic variation that is now fittest has changed, right? The selection process is now, it's adapting.
And just to draw that physics to evolution line a little clearer, like the amount of carbon we have in our atmosphere, the amount of heat because of the proximity to the sun, all of these things is what defines those constraints of evolution on Earth. So,
I mean, those are very fundamental constraints for our experience. I mean, you can see what happens when we start kind of abstracting away from them and treating them like they don't matter.
Yeah.
It's like our concepts of what we can do with energy and how we can do it. You just run into a wall if you try to pretend like the constraints aren't there. So I don't know if there's anything more fundamental than language in our cultural, experiment, right? Like everything to do with our interpersonal, like one of the things that I constantly like to highlight is how lossy our communication protocol is. And so the fact that you mentioned that is perfect, right? Because, we're constantly trying to, if we're participating awarely or deploying awareness in our current experience, then we're trying to adapt and curate our conversation in a way that makes it maximally communicative to the recipient. And depending on what that is, like it may require you to do a lot of pings with that individual to like find out how that information is landing. It's like we have packet loss type of things in digital communication protocols, right? It's like it's there everywhere. We have loss in compression protocols, and we have all these different ways in which loss can be instigated into different protocols, and it's irreplaceable in a sense. It's like when it gets to the other end, it's not the same as it left. Or once it's compressed, it's not the same as it was raw. And it never will be again. You don't just pop it back out to that resolution. And so the fact that we live in a world today where we're losing languages all the time, and language is becoming condensed, and more people use fewer languages. And there are advantages to that, but there are many disadvantages also, for sure. And
Tower Babel comes to mind.
Well, the I'm thinking back to even like what you mentioned before, Steve, with the idea of like, how do we connect to some of the information from the past, right? Because those were stored in protocols, right? Like language is memory. It's, I read something the other day, I don't remember where, but it was really interesting to me. It was, you know, the idea that you don't have memories before you have words. You know, there's this sense in which we are only capable of thinking within the bounds of the language we possess. You know, even within our internal dialogue, you're dialoguing with words, with yourself. And so in that sense, like the language that we develop is incredibly important. And language is a fascinating thing because it's also not something that you can just engineer from the top down, in a sense. Like language tends to be a relatively emergent kind of thing where it gets selected over time through utility and often through force and some other things. But, you know, at this point in the world today, it's mostly utility. And the question of, you know, how can we maybe continue to improve that? I think the first thing we have to do is like stop intentionally destroying it, because that's what I see happening in the world today. When you intentionally manipulate the definitions of established language, you break it. And you break it fundamentally because we use those definitions, like definitions are inclusive and exclusive necessarily. They need to define what a thing is and everything that it isn't. And once you've done that, then you can use it.
My favorite example of this really quickly is when you sent me that thing the other day about the new terminology for the slow correction of our economy is a growth recession.
Right. Growth recession. Right. You know, it's like, yeah, there is an old idea that something like words mean things. And
one of the
oldest of ideas, as a matter of fact.
I mean, here's you know, this is why it's such a fundamental and significant problem when you see these kind of things happening. So here's another example, right? It's like we live in the United States. The United States is fragmented into multiple little like subcultures. And, you know, we grew up in the West. Where do you live, Steve?
Toronto, Canada.
Okay. So different experience for you than a little bit, right? But like you'd be familiar with what I'm going to describe. It's like, you know, the Western United States in general is kind of a cohesive culture of relatively recently immigrated people because it hasn't been settled that long. But, you know, the South is specifically different than the Northeast. And you know, it's like, if you actually go to these places and you spend a reasonable amount of time and you make an effort to integrate yourself a little bit in the culture, and you do so in 3 or 4 disparate kind of subcultures within this single country, it's easy to see and very clear, like how a social media environment, lacking all of the context, but bringing all of these people together in one place causes absolute miscommunication, discommunication. Like it's nothing but chaos, you know, because like to reference again back to, you know, Kenny and I's relationship, our ability to, you know, leapfrog ideas because we can use common language has a lot of utility, because we don't have to stop and break down what did I mean by that word, or you know, there's relatively little packet loss in our communication between the two of us, and that just is relative. It's not zero, but when you start extrapolating that out and then you try to reach people at scale or something like that, then, you know, the necessity for definitions to be clearly and cohesively embraced is like paramount. Because as soon as you twist the definition, like one word changes a paragraph.
Yeah. And thus memes.
That's why I think like one of the most effective protocols for actually communicating information simply and effectively in the world today is the meme format.
There's a lot lower packet loss, especially if it's something that you have a lot of contributing players. Like, so you take the movie Friends, or the TV show Friends,
yeah.
right? Like, everybody's watched that. So not everybody, but so large of a percentage of the population that a meme from that will, if you're trying to go after a specific emotion or a specific, like, if you want to define constraint, you could probably put together a few memes from it and like, okay, here's the concept that I'm trying to get at of a constraint with a little bit of text with it, and there you go.
What's interesting about that is that memes are, as they're being used today, like explicitly a tying of language with visuals. And I think that is actually a way to get underneath language to a shared experience of, I love that scene in France. I know exactly what the juxtaposition between these two ideas they're getting at. And
because
now
you require context.
Frame, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it gives the context.
Yeah. And if you don't have sort of like, so I showed one to Kenny the other day that was a Seinfeld clip. You know, it's like a meme built into the long form meme, where, you know, they took a full clip and then inserted text at different points during different scenes. But, you know, it's like, it's ubiquitous media, like so common, especially, you know, amongst people of a certain age in certain demographics in certain countries, like so common that it allows you to put in the text and magnify the meaning of it, because the context is all built into the scene.
But also,
you know, you could just jump on top of all of that context, and now you can lay out your story, and it has, like, obviously it has nothing to do with Seinfeld, right? But the fact that you have this emotional context and like the interplay between the characters, and they're each maybe even archetypal in a sense, right? You can use that when you tell or use it explanatory, in a sense.
And think about it this way, right? This conversation is a good example. You know, I happen to be in a central point between the two of you, unless we can come together and have a much higher level communication protocol really very quickly. Now, so you extrapolate that out to a TV show that 300 million people have watched, right? Seinfeld becomes a through point that provides context for an idea that is transpersonal, right? Because we exist in the space of the other. So everyone has, you know, Seinfeld existing within them. And when I put out an idea on Twitter and somebody doesn't like it, they can very quickly set themselves up in opposition to me. Now, if Seinfeld says it, well, and it actually works, right? It's very important that you're not just arbitrarily doing this, right? You can't just put arbitrary words with arbitrary scenes.
Right.
It has to actually like contain the idea. And then in that case, like, they feel it from Seinfeld, and it's not, there's no me doing it, right? That's not even interesting. It's, oh wow, okay, like I get this because I was there and I know what I'm like when I'm Seinfeld.
It helps focus the attention on the message in a sense that way.
It removes the threat of the other.
Yeah.
But what I don't know if resolution is the right word here, but how much data can actually be transferred through memes, right? They're generally used for fairly trivial communications, and we're talking about flipping your entire sense of reality and self. I kind of joke about this with myself sometimes, because I'll write deep spiritual things on Twitter, and then I just imagine people like going through their day and just like stumbling upon them and being like, oh, there's no way I'm engaging with that like that because they're like getting groceries or something, you know what I mean?
So the positive side of that is most of what you're going to get is signal, not noise.
In response, you mean?
Yep.
Yeah, well, probably mostly fleeing, but yeah.
You get a heart for me.
Yeah, yeah. There you go.
Yeah. Well, that's how we got connected. I mean, I stumbled across
Sure. Yeah.
I stumbled across a couple of Steve's things, and we just had a Twitter thread, and then we were like, okay, we got to talk.
I mean, that's the incredible networking potential of a platform like Twitter.
Yeah.
You know, it's like there's plenty of content in my feed that isn't that.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, if that's actually what I'm looking for, then high signal.
You're already looking for it. That's kind of what I'm trying to get at. Is
well, so
a lot of these
I don't
networks,
think
they don't optimize, just briefly, they don't optimize towards truth and love. They optimize towards what you're already looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So you can bring people further down the road who have already started there, but it's very hard to ignite a new mind, I suppose.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a topic to which I would just defer to Jesus, I think. And like his example of the sheep and the goats. And not in any sort of derogatory kind of sense, because I don't think that's useful. I think the metaphor is actually that the place to spend the effort is not on the sleeping. Because you can't force anybody to wake up. You know, you can't force anyone to the point of engaging their awareness and, you know, contending with the disintegration. That usually has to come almost through circumstances, or, you know, it has to be self-initiated. Like, you know,
so I think
it's pretty tough to change people's minds.
You can kind of seduce, though, and I would say that Alan Watts seduced me into just thinking about those things. At first, I didn't take him too seriously, but over time, I kind of was like, "Yeah, I got to look into this," and it kind of built up.
But it's tough if, like, it's unlikely you're going to be ingesting a lot of Alan Watts if you don't have some openness already.
Yeah,
I think
like, the thing. I don't know how to initiate. You know, if you're coming from a place like we described before, where you've essentially kind of adopted an ideology and locked down inside of that, that's your, you know, your frame of thinking, everything has to make sense within there, or it's just disparate information. You just discard it or you attack it. Then, you know, every kind of mechanism that is part of that is to reinforce that. Like you don't get a mechanism to break that down and get out of it from within there. And, you know, so it seems like the prompts, I mean, there's an ancient kind of idea that it's the spirit that wakes people up. Like, there's prompts that come from, you know, being within the person that actually is what can ignite a desire to be willing to even start holding things in tension. Because that's like the first step, is like being able to engage new information without attacking it and discarding it. And we see that, I mean, that's so prevalent. Like, the social media world today is full of that kind of approach. You know, it's anything that's not team red is team blue, and so you attack it, right, if you're team red, and vice versa. And nuance is disintegrated and communication is fractured. And like, the idea that you're just that there's an effective way, especially at scale, to communicate something that like wakes up individuals. I'm not saying it can't happen, but I'm not sure that's the place to invest the most energy.
I think it depends on the side of it that you're on. That's kind of what I'm hearing a little bit from both of you, right? Is I think your point, Aaron, is something like, you can't manufacture this. And
it does. I mean, I don't know a formula, and I haven't
right,
seen or
exactly.
found one through history.
Exactly. And I think that's also a little bit like what you're saying, Steve, as well. Is like, it's not like Alan Watts showed up into your life and was like, hey, you're an idiot. You need to flip your reality. Right.
Oh yeah,
It was,
sure.
it was, it was like, hey, this thing that you think, great, cool. Well, until you think about this, and that's it. Right. And so I think it's something like that, right? Because one of the things that I've noticed is I don't have to like argue with anybody about anything, even if they see something very differently from where I do. I can like affirm their supposition and then just like ask a question, not like a confrontational question, but just ask a curious question about one of their presuppositions or assumptions that underlie it. And then like you do that like twice and people are done. Like people don't have nobody, it's very, very few people who have like levels of recursive philosophy that go beyond 2 levels, I've found. But if you do that like twice or 3 times, it's and you have to be genuinely curious. And for me, that the way that works out is like, hey, where does this go? Where can they go with it? Because I'm not worried about being, convinced or led astray or something.
But I think that I totally agree with
Also,
it.
not worried about being wrong. I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure I'm wrong right now. Plenty.
It also does require a certain level of honesty, though, because you can infinitely bullshit, like Rebecca says, and I have met people who, despite the fact that they don't have more than 2 propositional, as a foundation, they can actually laterally move forever, and that
Yes,
is a
that's
hard thing
true.
to get out of. Yeah.
That is true. I had a conversation with a fellow like that about a week ago, and I was just blown away. So yes, what I find is it's about 90 to 95% of people are actually will really engage if you do that. But then there's a few, and they tend to be highly institutionalized, highly successful people within their institutionalized frames that are like you're talking about, because they will bullshit endlessly.
Yeah, so let's get back to the Jesus as the best possible example. I forget what word I used, but how do you, I think it's easy enough to lay out how you end up heading towards hell, and I think that's kind of the easier thing, is to say that if you aren't deeply, powerfully honest, you lose your own awareness, you lose your own capacity to be totally. Or it's a spectrum towards totally. So that's the slide towards hell, and coming up and out of it. I'm just curious for your guys' frames. I know you're both Christian, and I want to hear from you, Jesus, that uplifting force, how to begin that trajectory, because it requires a willingness to endure or embrace pain that is so challenging to just suggest someone do, especially someone who's hurting actively. So how do you find that? I always see the signs, the billboards, like Jesus saves, Jesus will heal you of your sins, and I believe that in a certain sense.
Yeah.
But how does Jesus convince people that there's a way to let go of that burden, or to get out of the darkest places that they might be?
I think there's so the thing with Jesus is that you can talk about it from every level. So it's usually when it's misunderstood and done poorly by people trying to convey what it means for Jesus to save. The reason it's done poorly and is often very damaging to people when they are in pain, when they are hurting, is that it's done from a high level, speaking to a level where they need a very different understanding of Jesus. So there's all the theological stuff. Then I think, there's also this is why Jesus had to suffer so maximally, and why he had to have mercy on the people who were at the bottom of the hierarchy, right? The women who are about to be stoned for committing adultery, the slaves, the tax collectors, the people who were most ostracized, the people who are most downtrodden and hurting, people who are deepest in the depths of hell. Those are the people that Jesus reaches to in a very, very, very tangible way. And he doesn't reach for them in order. This is the crazy thing. Like, Jesus doesn't necessarily pull them out of it. He just lets them be where they are and lets them come out of it themselves. Like, that's the crazy thing about Jesus is that he doesn't force anyone to become anything. He doesn't give them he doesn't just like give them a ground and say, here, stand on it. He's like, no, become real. Like, it's not a new pattern. So I think it starts with Jesus, the sufferer, when you're in the place of suffering. And when you're coming out of that, you need to figure out, what do I do about it? That's a different question. It's a different question from the person who's just, I'm suffering. That's just, okay, then you just need the comfort, right? If you want to take the next step out of it, you say, okay, now how do I start to put myself back together? I think that starts with, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Because like you just said, if you have honesty, if you really have honesty, you actually get what it means to follow the truth, like, you'll come out of hell.
I think I would say that fundamentally the value proposition is a place to anchor meaning outside of the material world. The experience of suffering as a human is a material experience. And what Jesus actually offered was a way to transcend, or a reason to contextualize the experience beyond the material suffering. And I think that's actually the greatest value, because you can't deny pain. You can't, it's not artificial in a sense in our experience. So the justification for enduring pain is that it's not the most real thing. Not to say that it's not real, because it very obviously is, but it's not the only real thing. And it's not.
Do you think that immortality, that contextualization of the material not being permanent, allows you to see yourself as something beyond it? You think that that's related to the willingness to go through the pain?
Well, I mean, I think the constraint of mortality in the human experience is one of the most fundamental constraints we experience, obviously. Because it's our ability to perceive time and project a future in which we don't exist that, creates all of our anxieties around it. And, if the material is your ground of being, and then your human experience is your experience, rather than being, say, the experience of being in human form, or God in human form, in that kind of terminology, then the context, the justification for suffering well through pain within the material framework is zero, as far as I can tell.
It's only a lateral thing. It's to be stronger than others is the only thing you can come up with.
I mean, there's nothing other than a subjective kind of relative reference. And when you're in pain, that's less and less meaningful or compelling, right? Like, being in more pain than other people is not that great.
Yeah.
So, as far as I can tell, I think maybe that's the fundamental value that Christ came to reveal in that context for sure was that, you know,
it's cool because
the purpose of having being in the constraint of the human form is the feedback that engenders. And part of that is pain.
Yeah.
Mm.
That's what I was just going to say. Is the cool thing is it doesn't just show that there is a transcendence beyond it, but there's actually a meaning within the thing as well.
It shows the relevance of pain. It actually shows you how to integrate through making the pain relevant rather than meaningless. The pain now has a purpose, and pursuing it, pursuing agape through the pain now has, it gives you a way out. It literally the path out of hell. Yeah, that's fantastic. So I'm curious to bring up something, and I don't know if this is polarizing for you guys, so tell me if you don't want to go there or not. But I think that the traditional, me and Ken have talked about this a little bit, the traditional conception of Christianity is a personal God. And I'm very curious what your views on is there a personal God? Because I have views on this, and I think that it would be a very interesting space to explore if you guys are open to go there. But no problem if not.
Maybe because we haven't had this discussion, I would request a little bit of a further explanation of what you mean by personal God.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's many ways to interpret that. One I've heard Ken say, it led me to asking this question, so it's good for me to bring that up for context, which is that othering yourself and God is actually one of the things that will keep you stuck in a position of not entering the transcendental space. And that to me was like, wow, this is a totally different version of Christianity than I had heard before, because I had always heard that our ultimate place is beneath that in a rigid hierarchy, I suppose, rather than something that could actually flip up and around. And so that's why I'm asking.
Okay. So I'm not actually sure if most people would consider me to be a Christian at this point, based on some of the ways that the things are contorted, because I get the sense.
Yeah, you have a lot of. This is what
I get
terrible things about the word Christian.
I get the sense, that in a very real way, God's been very distorted for the last 400 or 500 years also. One of the things that happens when you constrict reality to the material world is that God must be embodied.
Oh,
and
that's an interesting concept. The state.
That's the introduction of the induction of artificial constraints upon being that don't exist. And essentially they essentially just become our definitions, applied and defining, constraining God. Or this is why we've tried to incline more towards using being or awareness at the bottom rather than this idea of God. Just because I think that the concept has gotten so distorted that it makes it really difficult for people to contextualize, because it's almost
impossible for God to not be made in the image of man.
Right, because man is in the image of God. And so, we so easily resort to or revert to a depiction of an old, the great father. Well,
yeah.
I mean, it's the great father, in some form or another. And it's, you see, I think, like, Jesus commonly refers to his relationship with being like that of a good father. And he also intimates repeatedly that we're all children of God. And I think that's not it's not a trivial term, because in the sense of say, like, hereditary, evolutionary, like context, we're children in the sense that we're all embedded with an instantiation of being. You know, like we all have that human being duality. We're not actually just humans. You know, like just a human would be like an ape. You know, it'd be like maybe a higher functioning animal. Like Kenny was saying, it's hard to go down that path and say like where awareness totally devolves, because there's certainly awareness within all kinds of creatures, right? It's not, I'm not going like panpsychism, but like there's a type of awareness that you can experience reciprocally, emotionally with animals and stuff, right? But they don't have that kind of relevance realization feature that allows you to create abstractions within the world and constrain yourself by them and then abstract on top of like that. That is being operating within the human that enables that progression. And as far as I can tell in that regard, like we're participatory in being. Now, if that makes God personal, then I guess that's what I believe. You know, at least at this point, like functionally, that seems to be the most useful way to contextualize the integration of being in the human. And, you know, it's like as a participatory element, like you can think of, you know, we're a node in a network. You know, we relay information back, we relay information across, you know, like it's hard for me to, I mean, it seems like a very, like I said, a useful way to contextualize our relationship towards towards being, because it's maybe open enough to incorporate enough of people's existing thinking to help draw connections without inducing all of the constraints that make it dogmatic. You know, it's like, again, if everything as far as we experience all of our right or wrong, our good or bad, all these sort of subjective qualifications that we place on things within the whole at a point, at a layer of unification, that's not like, it's not relevant in a sense. You know, it's like, it's part of the process. This is why agape is so necessary. This is why we have to apply it to ourselves. You know, it's because we're going to mess up the implementations along the way. We're going to miss the aim, right? We're going to pick the wrong mark sometimes, and sometimes, you know, we'll shoot at the wrong mark and still miss that, right? It's like sin happens everywhere in that regard. And this is why there has to be this constant, like a context of reconciliation. Like, and I see that Christ embodied that. Jesus embodied that. You know, it was this integration of human being with optimized relevance realization, you know, to the point where you pick the right mark and you hit it.
You know,
and, you know, like the implication is that we can be participating in that same kind of experience.
Yes.
And it's really not that it's from outside that comes in, right? It's already in us in that sense. It's just that we're disintegrated. Like the connection with being is actually what keeps us all alive. You know, the breath of life, that idea, it's like we're all the whole thing. I mean, think of it as a simulation if you want to, but like the whole thing is sustained by energy that's outside the system,
transmitted through breath.
And so even if you're totally disintegrated and you're blind and you're in the dark and whatever, like if you're still alive, there's still hope. I mean, there's a reason why these things kind of correlate. It's like, the breath of life is still there. Being is still present. It may be completely disintegrated. It might be, squished into the tiniest corner in a sense by your, the dogmatic pattern recognition machine. But it's still there to be awakened as long as there's life. There's something like that is, I mean, baked into our perception of human, like the sanctity of human life.
I think you're touching on something so fundamental there, because that's what Jesus did. He came and he participated with others in their own being, and that's what enabled them to be. And in that sense, I would say, and based on your guys' answers, I think you would agree that rather than the traditional personal God, which is a thing, and we can talk about that another time, but this idea of a participatory God is something you can both know and be. And to me, that's the most beautiful, that is the most positive conception of reality. It's the unifying, the unity of infinity would be the way, I don't know how else to say it. It's just this idea that we can join in the process of the nature of nature, or the essence of time, and be that with it.
The opportunity, the opportunity to participate with being in creation.
Yes, yeah.
The interesting thing is that the whole idea of God as personal really comes to the fore with Protestantism. And there's a way in which Protestantism is a strange, like, recursive loop on top.
I mean, that's the Reformation. Disintegration occurred right there.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, there's a way in which, like, if you want to get to the guts of Christianity, now I still maintain some very deeply Protestant bents. But if you're going to go deep into Christianity, like, if you don't read past 1500, like, you're not even reading about Christianity really, because what you get post Reformation in almost all Protestant thought, at least that I've encountered, and I feel like I've encountered some relatively deep thinking, is some version of Christianity. It's like a new floor. When we were talking earlier about the, a generation of a ground floor of language. Post-Reformation, you get like this new floor of language and this entire other branch off of Christianity. And I think the idea of the personal God comes out of that. And now I think a lot of Protestantism is in some ways like this recursive mirror on the ways in which the existential aspect of Christianity over the ages has gone wrong.
Well, I think
you always have
you have like, there's a problematic scenario that's pushing back against, right?
Yes,
and
exactly.
it's that, within the Orthodox or Catholic churches, as up until that time, there's a distinct, like, buffer from God. It's like, and that's clearly not present in Christ's experience.
And this
right?
is
It's
where...
like, so there's a legitimate contention to be made there. It's like, but like you said, it went wrong.
So this is the thing, right? It's at some point when you have a model that is properly, at least, especially that has been properly being adapted to dynamic reality, insofar as it doesn't, it has to create a mirror in order to figure out where it went wrong. So that's what happens in Protestant Christianity, is it creates this mirror to shine back and say, no, here's where we've gone wrong. But of course, the people who are going to who are going to continue to run that code, they get off on that branch and they're gone. Now, that doesn't
because
mean
it's
they're
not
like
iterative after that.
exactly. It doesn't mean they're like lost to hell or anything like that. I don't mean it in that way. I just mean they're going down a different line of thinking. And I think the personal God, as the way it's understood in the modern context, comes out of this. And it's a reflection on the way in which God became made in the image of man by the gatekeeping of God. And so
the fundamental problem is that neither one of them actually allow for participatory God, right?
Well,
it doesn't allow for
which part, but
yeah. Well, I mean, if you have this personal God idea that say generated through Protestantism.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes. Yeah.
Then, you're not in a position to participate like Steve mentioned earlier. It's very much of a kind of a hierarchical orientation. It's
necessarily an I thou.
And then, the preceding model that was reacting against was also not participatory. And it was even insulated further.
Well, there's a way in which, you can think about it this way, right? If we think about stages, as it were, of Christianity, you might say that in the initial stage, you have the emphasis on the transcendence of the one, and you do get participation in God. Like that is traditional Christianity. Is like the deepest aspects, I think, of traditional Christianity are the Neoplatonic ones, and that necessarily involves the self as participatory. The glory of God is a human being fully alive, and God became man so that man could become God. Like those are central theses in traditional Christianity. But like God wasn't low enough to be properly accessible either.
Well, because if you look at the actual experience of the people participating, like it was not the I'll say people like living, right? It wasn't a participatory like God is in you kind of experience. For the majority of the 1500 years leading up to the Protestant Reformation, it was primarily
for monks and ascetics.
Well, and I mean, look, there's a lot of legitimate logistical challenges to face when literacy is low and information is novel.
So let me finish here with so then you have the Protestant Reformation, right? And God becomes personalized, right? And now we live in the world where Jesus is my buddy. And it's just kind of this cultural thing that we do, but really we're postmodernists who place ourselves as equal to Christ and equal to God in the sense that we are just we are gods. We're judging each other. We get to make those distinctions, and we don't even realize that that's just now instantiated in what we claim to be Christianity. And so I think the next step is to fully bring God home. Right? It's to combine the two. It's to recognize that God is fully personal, closer to you than you are to your own self.
What's an allowance in a sense?
Yeah.
But also really, it has to break those other. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like God starts up here, comes down here. Now he has to go all the way fully in here so that he can be all of them at once.
Yeah, it's almost like God is the highest version of every layer of reality.
Yes.
In a sense.
Highest and lowest.
Sense. Yes, right? Exactly, in the fractal sense. Yeah.
Yes.
Because that's where they meet each other, the layers of reality meet at their own highest and lowest.
And this is
so he's a connective tissue of all the layers of reality.
Yeah. And this is, this is Paul, that God might be all in all. And this is the thing that's, I think, is why it's so actually, like a lot of people, and in my last conversation with John, this is the point we kind of touched on and moved around because I didn't know how to talk about it with him. But I don't understand why it can be, I understand culturally and narratively why it can be difficult. But from a metaphysics and ontology and all these theoretical perspectives, it's so much more beautiful if you allow for the possibility that Christ was actually God. I'm not saying it's necessarily right, but if you allow for that possibility, the whole thing becomes so much more beautiful. And it actually affords you space to allow for everything.
Well, I think that the challenge, yeah, I think the challenge there is that the layer of reality that you're pushing against is what humanity thinks of itself. And so this idea that God could be in humanity is, in order to accept the beauty of human potential, you have to acknowledge where humans are now, where you are now. Like it brings up so much honesty required to go there. I don't think it's conceptually difficult. I think it is emotionally daunting, because it's, I think in a very real sense, humanity is kind of an unlit star, where there's nothing that exists that is further from its potential than humanity. And I think to sit in that space is quite the ask, without a foundation that allows that to transmute rather than sit heavy on your shoulders.
Well, there has to be a layer of reconciliation.
Yeah.
Sorry, I missed what Ken said.
I said that's a strong argument.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Aaron.
Well, that's the natural situation of materialist view, right? Is that
you have to just reckon with that without anything beyond you.
Yeah, no matter what kind of framing you try to put around it or anything like that, you're always stuck with the knowledge that it's subjective, and you just picked a random abstract point or arbitrary point, right? And decided that was the truth and built out around that, and the experience is, of course, that we don't actually know what the truth is. We just pick up the lines as we cross them, and we build out the patterns as we go. And like the fullness of truth begins to kind of reveal itself, but it's not like something we can grasp or, encompass. We're limited. That's part of, the constraint of, you live a short time, you have a tiny little sliver of experience. And, if you're capable of communicating with other people across experiences, things like that, right, then you can kind of begin to synergize information. And we kind of begin to build out these models, but they're always vastly incomplete. And we don't have any recourse for that. It's like, if the only place you can draw from is within these incomplete, material world, like it always leaves you in that same position, right? Well, it's insufficient.
It's the thing
to reconcile, because you're going to know where this information is and where this information is within this relative, and that they can, contradict, or, and like, there's no way that you can leave this position without compromising all the other positions that are attached to it.
Right.
And that's a problem within this materialist framework. It's like, you can't, until you can begin to point outside of it and then reference back and be able to, see where the lines are going out, see where they're coming into our perception, and recognize that it is going both ways, right? And there is more beyond. And those lines point directionally towards where we should be focusing our attention, or, maybe sort of like the participatory link, that we experience when you actually connect the divine to the being element of the human being experience. But within that framework of the material, I don't see any reconciliation possible. It's just another place to hold tension.
I think this is what people have long pointed to the idea that the transcendent has to be purely simple and purely and in a weird, and has to be, undifferentiated. It has to be so simple and undifferentiated that it has to give you ground that is no ground.
I think all of this speaks to why I think awareness is fundamentally quantum. Because I think these material frames are basically insisting you use your own digital processor of thought and sometimes your analog processor of feeling to try and your intuition to try and put the puzzle together. But like you said, you're starting at an arbitrary point because you're not recognizing the wholeness that actually produces the recursive unity that is really there. And I think that what Jesus showed is that we actually don't exist. We as awareness do not exist in a world of limits at all. I think the limits are on the nature of our self, which is something we produce physically in this world from moment to moment. But what we are underneath that is actually capable of quantum computation, basically taking the totality of everything and comparing it against itself for a near lossless, perfect, I'm not saying everyone can do this easily, but I'm just saying that functionally we have the capacity to be God from here. Through here is a much better way of saying it. And I think that it's a challenging space to get to, but it's ultimately the idea of enlightenment is that is a space that humans can access. And all you have to do to get to that level of being is to drop the idea that you're a human, or just a human in that sense, to use the language that you were. And so I think that I think Ken referenced the movie Limitless, which is just kind of a fun one, but it really is, these limits are imposed on you based on where you're putting your own presence in your own being. And if you're in the left side of your brain or the right side of your brain, you are limiting yourself to the functions of it. And you can be in your mind and use both of them, and you're still limited as a self. But I think of it as kind of like the brainstem, where root awareness is, that can see both the right and the left hemispheres function without being either of them. So then that's my version of the Trinity, basically, is left hemisphere, right hemisphere, and brainstem. And that's like the fully agapic, lossless flow of quantum computation.
Yeah, I mean, or it's something like, the what translucent film that covers our whole, the membrane around our brain, right? It's like, that's maybe from an observational standpoint, the closest thing we can define as consciousness, but we have no idea how to reference that. It's like, but certainly the thing that connects the two, or
and transcends,
energizes,
yes,
in a sense, energizes the two.
The wielding of potential. I think energizes your own consciousness.
I think what you said is exactly right, because I think this is the reason, or the fundamental way to conceptualize miracles.
Yes,
because if the reality is that the future as we encounter it is unbounded potential, then and say, like, we impose a constraint that something like the previous state necessitates the following state based on an entropic kind of linear framework, then you just end up with all this like constant series of predictable outcomes. And within this framework of attention fixing matter, there's that constraint actually doesn't exist. And so that the implication is that the intentional manipulation of matter outside of the standard constraints of the model is possible with a proper or optimal kind of orientation.
You know, and that's an
You know,
interesting.
how to access, utilize, and you know, sort of function appropriately with that kind of knowledge or information. I'm not exactly sure, but I mean, it does seem to follow, you know, and it actually explains well within that kind of whole model.
And that basically makes what people have been pointing to as God, if you want to use this more modern language for it, it's like the most powerful psychotechnology you could imagine that we can actually all access. And we used to have it and we've lost it, which is crazy. I just, that's part of it I just can't understand right now. But it's so beautiful that the world we want to exist actually does. It's just we have to invert our relationship with ourselves to get there.
Yes.
Well, because we're the ones who are capable of inserting artifacts into reality through the projection of our own internal, you know, kind of human models.
Mm.
You know, it's like if you take your pattern recognition and codify it as preeminent, and then you start to project it, then you'll start to create, like you can create that into reality until it hits enough of a constraint that it breaks.
Well, and not just in the idea space. This is straightforwardly how you work in the material.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you postulate a pattern and you project it into the world. I mean, you do it by means of attention, right? And if you like, I was explaining agape to a friend of mine the other day, and he'd never even heard of the term before. And I was like, look, man, like if you go to build a table and you have a pile of wood, if you don't show agape towards that table, right? Say you just have arrows, you just need a table. You just really want a table, and you just need to have it. Like you're going to put together kind of a, you know, it may work, but it's not going to be that beautiful, and it probably is not going to be that well made and last that long. Now, if you show agape in your attempt to create a table, you may make and if you really show agape to it, you may make a piece of art that's one of a kind. And I mean, so this is one of the things that I like to do with this. It's like, let's make it really materialized. Let's make it very straightforward so that like you can't avoid it.
Yeah, I think that's really important to touch on, because you can build a table without love, right? You can build a life without love. You can actually come to truth. And I'm using a smaller version of that word right now than the ultimate, but you can come to truth without love. And I think that's what a lot of the world is pursuing right now. But you can't come to the ultimate truth of your own nature without love. You can't come to the nature of nature without love, because it is crushing emotionally to try and go there. Like you propositionally, you can't bear the weight of the door you knock on. I just think you can't. You have to actually get to a place where your own resistance to truth and what is filtered through a form of beauty that's so pure it filters you out instead of it.
Yes, that's right.
And so that union of truth and love is so fundamental.
Yeah, I want to go back to something that you were saying, Aaron, in the discussion about miracles, and talking about how the perception that causation from one moment to the next is a necessary hard constraint. So there's a way in which we're creating the constraints, even the hard constraints, possibly, in this model. Like they're dependent in some way on the orientation that the collective humanity holds, because there is some kind of participatory element. Because whenever Jesus does a miracle, he says it's your fate. There's a participatory aspect, and there's so there's a way in which our movement over time under sin, you might say, under Satan, which is like, you know, the operating system that operates by means of the accuser to create a, you know, a recursive loop of cells that accuse each other and thus create artifact, something like that. Like when that system is operational, then like what you get is the hard coding of constraints. It's like the definitional movement of that is you get hard coded constraints, and technology accepts that to where you get, you know, an infinite, like you were talking about with the financial system, right? An infinite regrets of artificial constraints filled with niches of parasitism.
He's got a really funny image where basically what Satan is the Spider-Man meme where they're both pointing at each other, like, but infinitely looped. Yeah.
Oh yeah, there we go.
Well, I mean, it's always been the case that we forge our own chains.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I mean, here's one of the problems is like within the framework we've had is if you start looking for God within the material world, the only place you actually find him is inside yourself. Like, because that's where being is in the material world. And inside people. Every person, right? In that sense. And the problem is if you're seeking for meaning of life, and the only place you can find God is inside yourself, that's not going to satisfy you either, because you're totally aware of the internal conflict that exists. You know, it's like finding God just inside yourself. So like,
until you've made the transcendental
until
leap.
you get to that transcendental leap, right?
Yeah.
You get past the space-time barrier of the material world.
Yeah.
And you allow that being that you find, if you're looking for it and you find it within yourself, it's that same being.
Yeah.
That's
solipsism.
That's beyond, you know, all of our obviously capabilities to define and depict, because, you know, it's well beyond our framework of experience, but it's the same thing. I mean, it's literally an instantiation, as far as I can tell, it seems to be an instantiation of that same thing. And that's what gives you the, you know, the necessary protocols to communicate or participate with that being. It's like you have to be a child of God to even have that potential.
Yeah.
You know, to have the code running to communicate across that protocol.
Yeah.
And like, if you do, and if you engage it, and if you like orient towards that, then that's what's going to, I mean, that's how agape is expressed through the world. It's how the pattern of being is replicated in the world through, you know, the attention of being. It's still all being making it happen, right? But when it happens with, you know, through the artificial constraints of the human being connected, like, that's a really special thing. Because for being to operate as being when it's unconstrained is trivial, beyond trivial, obviously. But to operate as being from within the kind of constraints that we experience as a human is divine.
And I think further on that level of humanity itself, and I've come to think of it as like the health of our distributed network. You know, how efficiently are we operating for our own, you know, purpose? And the idea, just the most beautiful thing I can summon is a divine humanity, where people are joining in union in these spaces, and the collective humanity is working for the individual humanity, not against it, as it is today. I think that is I hope that's the world we're going towards, and I can see it now, and it's something that lights up every day that I have compared to before.
It might be the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah.
like we don't really have any decent way to conceptualize what that, that's almost like a meme from the past in a sense. It's like without much context for anyone to tell that story. It's like a couple people had some dreams and visions, and this is how they decided to kind of talk about how it could be.
Mm-hmm.
And
the other thing to recognize is it may take thousands of years to get there.
Yeah.
But man, do I want to take that step today, that first step. Like it's not up to this level of us to decide when this happens or whatever, but to realize that is the grand pattern going on is in itself the great attractor, sort of.
And technically begins to actualize it, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, if any of this model is correct, which again, we're not in any kind of total sense, but in a
utilitarian sense,
in a pointing at sense, it seems to be, because it's highly convergent with about as deep of things as you can come up with. So
yeah,
I mean, then whether it, like you said, whether it's in 1,000 years or tomorrow, there's a manner in which, like, just doing this and just trying to follow agape, even in the messiest sense of our own brokenness from a day-to-day existential perspective, does actualize the kingdom of heaven in eternity.
Well, I think the best thing, and also, the long-term trend line is something like the best thing you can do is continually be trying to communicate these ideas and share them with other people and live honestly and participate in being and creating the world that way, right? It's like,
go forth and share the gospel.
There's never a context given where there's a guarantee of this kind of experience or this kind of outcome or this anything in within the span of a human life. But the goal that's always held out ahead is like, that there is another coming of Christ. And this seems to be something that's actually kind of a pattern, and Christ in the sense of an archetype, not in the sense of Jesus Christ. Because, I kind of mentioned this before, but I think, it's like, this is one of those patterns that has sort of an iterative aspect to it. You get kind of this depiction of Adam, and then Noah, and then Moses, and then David, and then by the time Jesus has to come from the line of David by the time it gets to that point, right? And then once you have Jesus, you have like the full embodiment of being inhuman. Everything else to that is sort of like a progressive embodiment that brings a reconciliation for the time. And then, what Jesus points towards is another coming of Christ. But it doesn't seem to indicate in any way that it's another individual embodiment of being. Maybe it's more like a collective embodiment of being. I mean, that's the idea of the church, it seems like. I mean, because what the churches are today is nothing like that, right? They're just organizations, mostly wielding power and influencing people. And, like the actual objective is awareness oriented by being, deployed by humanity at scale.
And I think another way of phrasing that was landing for me as you were speaking was to see heaven on the horizon and know that it is coming. And it doesn't have to come in the life of this physical body. You can see it, you can see as it, you can know it and be it to the level that you know that it's eventually going to come. And I think you can like be a beacon of hope and faith for people just by having that presence, holding that space for when people, I think that's what Jesus was doing. When they looked to Jesus, they saw the heaven that he saw right there, and they saw that possibility. That is infinite possibility. That's what they're witnessing.
Actually, like someone
beautiful.
Actually engaging with possibility like it's infinite.
Exactly.
And you can engage with
being it. But yeah, I think that like what awareness is combinatorially explosive. It is infinite potential. But it, you can convince it that it's constrained by things that are not. But fundamentally, yeah, it's an infinity drive.
And there's something there too also that's like, if you're going to be rearranging the material world, you have to do so in a way that it does reflect the pattern when you're done.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It's like you don't actually just get to warp the material world around however you want.
Yeah. Like, it's not magic in that sense, but it is the real kind of magic, which there's a level of freedom in every moment, and you can be.
It only integrates.
Yeah.
Right. It's not a disintegrating force.
Well, you only get power to the degree that you're able to, play around with things and only break things that only matter a little bit. So, the reason that we don't have the kind of power that legends hold that humans possibly once possessed might be not that they're, mythical legends. It might have something more to do with the fact that we've lost the level of consciousness and requisite humility to actually wield the kind of powers for real being.
I couldn't imagine putting a limit on what miracles, the ultimate capacity of them now from this space, which is, again, a couple of years ago, I would never have said anything like that. But when you realize what creates limits and you realize what awareness ultimately is, you realize that absolutely any limit is being placed on something smaller than what we ultimately are.
And I think, it's so freeing in a sense to recognize constraints and limitations, not as negatives, but actually as the tools that give us that even afford the potential for feedback.
Coherence. Nothing can be relevant unless it's coherent. And I think that it provides a temporary coherence for change to occur upon.
Yeah, iteration of abstraction. And, with the intent always of replicating that pattern of being fractally at ever higher levels of representation.
Yeah. Okay, we have to stop at some point.
Yeah, I don't know what else to add to that. I feel like we covered the whole thing. That was awesome.
It's a broad spectrum, but enjoyable for sure. And, it's like I said earlier, like this is just a working model in my life, Kenny's life, like anybody we can find who will listen to us. We just kind of share it and try it. Think like just the context of engaging the world and how you think what you think you're doing when you're doing it. And it feels like it works. It's not in a question of like, I'm not out moving mountains and stuff, right? It feels like it works in like
mental mountains.
Orientation, like fine-tuning orientation even, rather than just like, feels like a decent day, nothing really went sideways.
Yeah.
It's like, and really, really, where's your awareness focused? How is your attention directed? And what is it creating? Because it's always creating something.
And it doesn't matter how exhaustive your model, no matter how beautiful and accurate it might be. If you have a really impressive mental model and your marriage is falling apart, and you don't have good relationships with your kids, and you're a closet alcoholic, those kinds of things, it like the existential, I think, has to come first. And that's where I'm at with this. Like exactly like you're saying, man. It's like, does does it translate in a way that my experience of my own being deepens, expands, and is afforded the possibility of transcendence beyond what I was yesterday? I mean, if we'd had this conversation 2 or 3 months ago, I wouldn't have been talking about this stuff on this level. It's like the movement from day to day, because it's held in an open hand and you can expand, allows and affords for it, and like a recursive self-transcendence. Not that every day is that.
It's the only way to experience growth.
Yeah.
Absolutely insane conversation. I loved every minute of it, guys. That was great. Look forward to more for sure. I think that, there's a level of complexity that we could iron out and streamline some things. But as far as like the completeness of the model or the implications, I don't think they could be grander. I think that this just seems like the prescription for what the world needs to a degree that is hard to express to me. Yeah.
I just gotta make the memes.
Yeah.
Hey, that text to speech or that text to video AI thing,
it's amazing stuff. It's amazing stuff.
I'm interested to see what we could, like, if we start messing around with that, what we might be able to generate.
Yeah.
The overhead is so low also compared to the traditional ways of developing media.
Also, what a legendary Trojan horse moment if you take AI and you're able to build a media message that actually wakes everyone up, or not every, but like enough that you actually reach critical mass. Like that would be amazing.
Yeah, we're getting ways of, every technology is a psychotechnology, really, when you get down to it, and the potency of some of these technologies combined with spiritual technologies can really accelerate our path towards kingdom of heaven on earth. And at the same time, these technologies, in the absence of that spiritual psychotechnology, will lead to our destruction.
Well,
so it basically comes down to, we have to pair the spiritual technology with these technologies, or we're in a lot of trouble.
So this is a great example. I was going to mention this earlier because you said something that prompted this thought for me before. Like, this is why you don't crucify the flesh. Is because you actually need that pattern recognition machine part. That human part is essential. And I think this is where like a lot of emphasis got kind of misdirected.
Yeah.
Especially maybe in the Protestant faith, but
and the really, word really flesh there is so poorly understood.
Yeah, it's like, this idea that you're always going to be fighting against that tendency to devolve into an acceptance of the material as the most real, the most important, right? But the answer isn't to crucify, kill, destroy, separate that. The answer is to integrate it underneath the optimized divine relevance realization, so that you can really, utilize the potential of what the human brain is capable of. Like we have no idea what that is. Like we just see sparks of it, like here and there, like somebody's just like burns out. And it's like, wow, they were like the trajectory of their thinking was just insane. Like, it's like novel, crazy, wild, but like, we got all this potential. Like, the point of being coupled with this constraint mechanism and system is not to kill it. It's to optimize it.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Like this is where we interfere with the mechanism of natural selection and all that. And who's to say that's not why? That we have this consciousness in this kind of embedded constrained environment. It's like, because, the constraint structures that were existing were useful to a point, and like they're still going to exist, like they're still useful, but it's time for other ones on top.
And they need to be nested within the fractal.
And they actually need to be divinely inspired.
Yeah.
Or they won't work.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been fun.
Yeah,
word,
Ken,
Steve?
well, just next time we chat, I really want to dive into what you brought up there, which is how is this relevant or salient in day to day and pursuing life with the, given all of this, and interacting with others in different spaces. I think there's a lot more to go into there. I'm curious to go there with you next.
Yeah.
Awesome. As well, Aaron, of course.
Sounds great.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, we'll do this again. It's been a pleasure.